642 people, men, women, children as young as 1 week old, locked inside a church in a quiet French village on a Saturday afternoon. The doors were barred, the incendiary device was lit, and when it was over, the smoke rising from Oradour Sur Glane could be seen for miles. But here's what makes this story unlike any other massacre in history. The French government never rebuilt the village. They left it exactly as it was. Every burned car, every collapsed wall, every bullet hole, a ghost town, frozen in the exact moment of its death. And the reason they preserved it will haunt you far more than the massacre itself. To understand why, we need to go back much further than 1944. Throughout recorded history, there are moments where an entire community faces the same impossible question, not individually, together, surrender and risk a fate potentially worse than death, or choose death on their own terms. It's a choice most of us will never have to make. But for the people of Oradour Sur Glane in 1944, and for the Cathars of Montségur in 1244, and for the Jewish defenders of Masada in 73 AD, it wasn't hypothetical, it was the last decision they would ever make. This is the story of villages that chose annihilation over submission, communities separated by centuries, by continents, by language and faith, yet bound together by the same terrifying covenant, a pact with death itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened in these places, but why, and that answer might disturb you more than the events themselves. Let's start with what we know for certain. June 10th, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, Allied forces were pushing inland from the beaches of Normandy, and across occupied France, the German military was growing increasingly paranoid about resistance activity. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, was moving north from Toulouse toward the Normandy front. They'd already committed atrocities along the way, hangings, reprisal killings, entire families dragged from their homes. But Oradour Sur Glane was different. It was a sleepy village in the Haute-Vienne department of central France. Population, about 650. It had no strategic value, no known resistance cell, no weapons cache. The villagers were farmers, shopkeepers, schoolchildren. On that Saturday afternoon, many families from surrounding areas had actually come into Oradour for routine medical checkups and to collect their tobacco rations. The village was fuller than usual, and that detail, that ordinary mundane detail, would prove catastrophic. Because at approximately 2:15 p.m., a convoy of SS troops rolled into the village square and ordered every single inhabitant to assemble. They said it was an identity check, nothing more. But there was one thing the soldiers brought with them that no one noticed at first, and it would change everything. The men were separated from the women and children. That was the first sign. The men were divided into 6 groups and marched to 6 different locations, barns, garages, sheds, scattered around the village. The women and all the children, some 450 of them, were locked inside the church of Saint-Martin. Now imagine you're standing in that village square. You've just been told this is a routine check, your papers are in order, you have nothing to hide, but they're separating you from your family. Your children are walking away from you, toward the church, holding their mother's hand. And something in the air feels wrong. The soldiers aren't checking papers. They're positioning machine guns. At each of the 6 locations where men were gathered, the SS opened fire. They aimed low, at the legs first. They didn't want quick deaths. They wanted the men alive when they set the buildings on fire. Survivors later described hearing the screaming from multiple directions simultaneously. The entire village became a kill zone in minutes. But what happened inside the church was worse, far worse. The soldiers placed a large incendiary device near the nave. When it was ignited, the women and children tried to escape through the doors and windows. The SS had stationed gunners at every exit. Of the approximately 450 women and children locked in that church, only one survived. Her name was Marguerite Roufanche. She was 47 years old. When the incendiary device exploded and the church filled with smoke and screaming, Marguerite climbed onto the altar and threw herself through a narrow stained glass window behind it. She fell 3 meters to the ground outside. An SS soldier spotted her and opened fire. She was hit 5 times, but she crawled, bleeding, broken, into a garden and hid among rows of pea plants until the soldiers left. She was the only woman to survive the church. In total, 642 people were killed that day. 197 men, 240 women, 205 children. The youngest victim was a 1-week-old baby. And here's what investigators discovered that shifted everything. The soldiers had brought the incendiary device with them, pre-assembled, ready to deploy. This was not a spontaneous reprisal. This was not soldiers losing control. This was planned. The village had been selected in advance. But here's the question that has never been fully answered. Why Oradour? Why this village, with no resistance connections, no military value? There's a theory that has persisted for decades. The SS may have confused Oradour Sur Glane with a nearby village, Oradour Sur Glane, which did have resistance ties. A clerical error, a misread map. 642 people may have died because someone got the name wrong. After the war, Charles de Gaulle visited the ruins. He stood in the charred shell of the church. He walked the silent streets where burned-out Peugeots still sat on deflated tires, where sewing machines had melted into the floors of living rooms, where children's shoes lay scattered in schoolyard ash. And he made a decision that would define this place forever. The village would not be rebuilt, not one stone would be moved. Oradour Sur Glane would remain exactly as the SS left it, a permanent wound in the French landscape. A new village was built nearby for survivors and returning families. But the old village, it became a memorial, a place where time stopped at 2:15 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon in June. You can visit it today, you can walk those streets. The rusted hulks of cars are still there, the walls still stand, roofless, open to the sky. Bullet holes still pock the stone, and here's the thing that visitors say stays with them longest. It's the silence. Not the ruins, not the memorial plaques, the silence. An entire village, frozen in its moment of death, where no bird seems to sing. But Oradour was not the first community to be preserved in the amber of its own destruction. And this is where the story reaches back through centuries to a phenomenon far older and far more disturbing. March 16th, 1244, the fortress of Montségur perched on a limestone peak in the French Pyrenees. For 10 months, the Cathar community inside had endured a siege by a crusading Catholic army of over 10,000 soldiers. The Cathars were a Christian sect that Rome had declared heretical. Their beliefs threatened papal authority, and so the Albigensian Crusade had spent decades hunting them across southern France. Montségur was their last refuge. When the walls were finally breached, the commanding officer offered terms. Renounce your faith, walk free. Over 200 Cathars, men, women and children, refused. They didn't fight, they didn't attempt escape. They walked willingly, singing hymns, down the mountainside to a field where an enormous pyre had been constructed, and they stepped into the flames. 225 people, together, by choice. Now go back further, 73 AD, the fortress of Masada, overlooking the Dead Sea. 960 Jewish zealots had held out against the Roman 10th Legion for months. When the Romans finally built a massive siege ramp and prepared to breach the walls, the defenders made a pact. They would not be taken alive, they would not be enslaved. According to the historian Josephus, they chose 10 men by lot to kill the others. Then one of the 10 killed the remaining 9. Then he fell on his own sword. 960 people, gone, by their own hands. 3 events, 3 communities, separated by nearly 2,000 years. And here's where the conventional narrative breaks down, because the people of Oradour Sur Glane didn't choose death, they were murdered. The Cathars of Montségur walked into the fire voluntarily. The defenders of Masada killed each other by agreement. These are fundamentally different events, so why do they feel the same? Psychologists who study mass covenant death point to something called identity fusion. When an individual's sense of self becomes so deeply merged with their group that the group's survival and the individual's survival become indistinguishable. When the group faces extinction, the individual doesn't experience it as an external threat, they experience it as personal death, and at that point, the method of dying becomes the only choice left. The Cathars didn't see surrender as survival. To renounce their faith was to die spiritually, which to them was worse than physical death. The zealots at Masada didn't see Roman slavery as living. Their identity was freedom, and without it, they were already dead. But here's the twist that historians rarely discuss. The people of Oradour were not given a choice. They were assembled under false pretenses. They were lied to. And yet, France chose to preserve their death, to freeze it, to make their destruction permanent and visible for eternity. In doing so, the French government made a collective decision about how an entire community would be remembered, not as people who lived, as people who died. And that choice, the choice made by the living about the dead, might be the most unsettling covenant of all. So let's return to where we started. That church, that smoke, those 642 people who never came home from a Saturday afternoon. Marguerite Roufanche, bleeding in a garden, hiding among pea plants, listening to the gunfire fade. She survived. She testified. She told the world what happened inside that church. And then France built a glass case around the village and said, "Look, never look away." But when you stand in those ruins today, and thousands of people do every year, you are not just witnessing a massacre. You are participating in a covenant, a silent agreement between the living and the dead, that this moment matters more than all the moments that came before it. The same covenant the Cathars made on the mountainside, the same covenant the zealots made on the cliff, the choice to say, "This is who we were, this is how we end. Remember us like this." The method changes, fire, sword, machine gun, but the covenant is always the same. It says our death is our final act of identity, and that is why 7 centuries after Montségur and 2 millennia after Masada, we are still talking about villages that chose death, not because the dying was remarkable, but because the choosing was. We build monuments to the dead, we preserve their ruins, we tell their stories in videos like this one. But here's the question I can't shake. When we remember them, are we honoring their choice, or are we making it for them? Some questions don't have answers, only echoes, and this particular echo has been reverberating for over 2,000 years. It shows no sign of fading. The dark ledger has many pages, and some of them were written in ash. The next one might be the entry that stays with you longest.